It was 9:37 p.m. when Elena first noticed the flickering bulb above her kitchen sink. She stood still, letting the rhythm of the blinking lights stutter into the shadows like a heartbeat gone wrong. In her hands was a chipped ceramic mug of tea, untouched. On the counter, a glowing laptop screen showed 6 tabs open: electricity, water, credit card, medical bills, prescriptions, insurance. Same as always. The cursor blinked back at her, patient and indifferent, while a slow, aching tension spread between her shoulder blades. She took a breath, then another. Then she sat down. Each number she typed felt heavier than the last. Each bill submitted another tiny slice of herself peeled away. She wasn't even living there anymore, not really. But somehow, it was always her job to keep her childhood home running, her parents afloat, her family's fragile world intact. She hadn't planned it that way. No one asked. It just happened. Roger and Linda, her father and mother, had once been strong, or at least they liked to think so. Roger was a retired firefighter who still watched reruns of Ladder 49 like it was a documentary of his youth. Linda had been the type to volunteer for everything: church choir, PTA, the city bake-off. But time hadn't been kind. Roger's back gave out a decade ago and never recovered. Linda's joints followed soon after, softening her steps, hardening her tone. They'd stopped fighting the decline, and Elena had quietly stepped in. But tonight, for the first time, she felt something shift. It started small, a tightness in her jaw as she paid the gas bill, then a hollow ache in her chest as she moved on to prescriptions. When she reached the final tab, monthly mortgage contribution, Elena Smith, her hand trembled. No one had thanked her in months. The house she was helping keep alive wasn't even hers. It wasn't even warm. She pictured her mother folding laundry in silence while the TV buzzed with some cooking show neither of them liked. Her father in his recliner, dozing off, remote balanced on his stomach. They were there. But emotionally, it was like they'd vanished years ago. She hit submit on the last payment and shut the laptop with a soft click. There had been a time, just a few years back, when she told herself it was fine. Noble even. She made good money in software. She didn't have kids. She could handle it. But nobility without acknowledgement starts to rot into something else, something sharp and bitter. The wind rustled outside, swaying the Spanish moss that clung to the oak trees of Savannah's historic district. Elena stared through the window at the swaying shadows and let herself wonder, for the first time in years, what would happen if she just stopped. Just stopped. She didn't even realize she was crying until a tear rolled down the slope of her cheek and landed on the keyboard. The sound of her phone buzzing jarred her back into herself. "Mom, pizza tonight. Can you order?" "Don't forget your dad likes extra cheese." Elena blinked. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream. Instead, she texted back, "Sure." And just like that, the moment passed. At dinner the next night, Elena arrived at her parents' house carrying 3 boxes of pizza and a 6-pack of ginger ale. Linda barely looked up from the stove. "Oh, great. You remembered," she said, then waved toward the fridge. "Could you restock the drinks?" Roger, predictably, was already half asleep on the couch, the game show channel flickering across his closed eyes. Dinner was a routine, not a reunion. Linda recounted gossip from the church choir. Roger muttered half-thoughts about taxes and lawn maintenance. Isabel's name popped up, again. "She just sent a picture of her new painting," Linda said, scrolling through her phone. "She's so creative. I just don't know how she gets all these ideas." Elena nodded. She knew better than to expect questions about her own life. After the plates were cleared, Linda handed her a stack of envelopes. "Oh, and these came in today. You probably know what to do with them." "No, thank you. No acknowledgement. Just you probably know." Elena smiled tightly and tucked them into her bag. As she walked out to her car that night, the air was thick with humidity. The sky was bruised with clouds. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. She sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, and whispered, "If I disappeared tomorrow, I wonder how long it would take them to notice." Then she laughed. A soft, broken sound that didn't quite reach her throat. That Wednesday, she returned, just like always, with groceries in tow and an Amazon package addressed to Linda. The front door was unlocked. She stepped inside. "Mom," she called. "Back here." Linda's voice floated from the hallway. Elena wandered through the house, placing the bags in the kitchen, setting the delivery on the dining table. She noticed something odd, a half-filled scrapbook lying open. Curious, she leaned over. Page after page was Isabel. School plays, art shows, college dorms, backpacking trips. Elena flipped further. There was not a single photo of her after age 10. Something inside her cracked. She walked to the kitchen, intending to leave, but she needed water first. She opened a drawer for a glass and paused. A thick envelope rested on top of some napkins, labeled in Linda's handwriting, "Will." It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't exactly meant to be seen either. Elena stared at it. The smart thing would be to walk away. Instead, she opened it. The document inside was clear, legal, and merciless. "We, Roger and Linda Smith, being of sound mind, leave all property, assets, and material belongings to our beloved daughter, Isabel." Elena's name wasn't mentioned, not once, not even as a footnote. She read it again, slower. She even checked the date. Current, updated last year. Her throat closed, her knees buckled. She sat down, the envelope slipping from her hand onto the kitchen floor like a confession. There it was, the truth. After everything, after the bills, the errands, the check-ins, the care, they'd left her behind. They'd written her out of the narrative. She was invisible even in death. The fridge hummed beside her. A fly buzzed lazily in the corner. She sat there for 10 minutes before standing up, collecting the envelope and slipping it back where she found it. Then she left. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. And now, before we continue this story, take a moment to ask yourself something. If you were Elena, would you A. confront your parents right away and demand answers? B. walk away in silence to protect yourself? Let me know your choice in the comments below. Just drop A or B, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Your support keeps us going and helps us bring even more powerful, emotional family stories to life. Now, back to Elena. The house she walked out of that day didn't know it yet, but something irreversible had begun. A silence was coming that would echo louder than any words she might have said. The silence that followed Elena's discovery of the will didn't roar. It hummed. Low, quiet, steady. It crept into her days like fog rolling into a harbor, wrapping itself around everything she thought she'd known and muting it. She went to work. She answered emails. She smiled at her coworkers when she had to, but inside, something had disconnected, and for the first time in years, she had no desire to plug back in. That weekend, Linda called twice and left a voicemail on the second attempt. "I think your father needs a ride to his blood pressure checkup. Can you take him Monday?" It wasn't angry or demanding. It was matter of fact, like always, like nothing had changed. Elena stared at the voicemail bubble for nearly an hour before deleting it. She didn't reply, didn't call back. She didn't take Roger to his appointment. She simply let the request fall into the same space where all her years of sacrifices now seemed to live, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and entirely expected. On Sunday, instead of driving across town with groceries and coupons, she sat at a local cafe with her laptop and ordered brunch for one. She sipped a cinnamon latte slowly, watching couples and young families pass by, and realized she could barely remember the last time she felt like a daughter in the sense that mattered. Being useful wasn't the same as being loved. Being reliable wasn't the same as being seen. By the following week, her absence hadn't gone unnoticed, but it hadn't been mourned either, at least not outwardly. Linda assumed, as always, that Elena was just busy. She explained this to her neighbors with a patient smile, brushing off concern the way someone might swat away a fly. "She's working a lot. You know how she is. So dependable, that one. She'll be back around soon." But the groceries never arrived. The porch light, usually replaced without a word, flickered out and stayed dead for 3 days. The online prescription refill Linda never learned to do expired. The power bill came in late with a small fine attached, something that hadn't happened in years. Roger didn't say much. He never did. When asked, he grunted, flipped the channel, and said, "She'll call when she's ready." But Elena didn't call. She wasn't waiting to be begged back. She wasn't hoping for tears or guilt or a grand apology. She just needed the silence for once, to belong to her. It was her own small protest, her act of rebellion against the invisible cage she'd been living in, and it felt right, even when it hurt. That Thursday, as if summoned by the weight of the week, Mrs. Raines from next door knocked on Linda's door, holding a small tin of lemon bars. "I haven't seen your daughter around. Everything okay?" she asked, the kind of question wrapped in warmth and nosiness that only the elderly could deliver without sounding offensive. Linda hesitated. "Oh, she's she's fine, I'm sure." Then, as if convincing herself more than the neighbor, she added, "You know how kids get. Busy lives. I'm just glad Isabel always makes time to call." Mrs. Raines nodded politely, but her eyes lingered on the door long after she left. That evening, Linda stood in the kitchen peeling carrots and noticed the quiet. Not the usual peaceful kind, but something more hollow. The air seemed to stretch too wide. She glanced toward the front window where Elena used to park her car. The driveway was bare. In a sudden moment of impulse, she opened the bottom drawer of the kitchen hutch and pulled out an old photo album. Dust clung to the cover like a forgotten memory. She hadn't looked through it in years. As she flipped through the pages, she smiled at Isabel's toothy childhood grins, her painted fingers, her school art fair ribbons. Page after page was filled with Isabel's milestones: a papier-mâché volcano, a middle school recital, a blurry photo of her first apartment in Brooklyn, and then, almost out of place, a picture of Elena at age 10, arms crossed, hair tucked behind one ear, standing in the background of a birthday party that didn't seem to be hers. That was the last photo. The rest of the album continued as if Elena had simply stopped existing. Linda stared at it, her smile fading. She hadn't noticed before how little of Elena's life she'd captured. Or maybe, she thought bitterly, she hadn't wanted to notice. She snapped the album shut and pushed it back into the drawer. Roger sat in the living room, muttering at the evening news. "You think she's mad?" he asked without looking up. Linda didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I think maybe she's tired." Neither of them said anything more. Elena, meanwhile, had begun to fill her time with silence on purpose. She walked the marsh trails near her apartment, letting the wind off the water kiss her skin, letting the rhythm of cicadas and rustling reeds become louder than her thoughts. She attended yoga for the first time in months. She baked banana bread and gave half of it to her elderly neighbor. She texted Caleb's mom to ask if he'd like extra tutoring before his science fair. For the first time in a long while, she gave her energy to people who noticed, who said thank you, who looked her in the eye. Isabel called once. Elena didn't pick up. She wasn't angry with her sister. How could she be? Isabel had always been adored, always been the muse, the free spirit. She hadn't asked for the pedestal, but it still hurt that she'd never noticed Elena carrying the weight of everything in the shadows. The worst part was that even now, no one was reaching out with anything other than obligation. No one was asking how she felt. No one was apologizing. On the 11th day of her absence, Linda made banana bread. She wrapped it in foil, left it on the counter, then called Elena and left a message. "Sweetheart, I baked your favorite. It's still warm. Come by, okay?" Elena didn't call back. She sat on her balcony that night, overlooking the lit streets of Savannah, and thought about how a life could become so quietly imbalanced. She wasn't angry anymore. Not in the sharp, raging way, but she was grieving. Grieving the love she thought she had. Grieving the years she'd spent trying to be enough for people who only ever wanted her usefulness. The next day, as Linda folded laundry, she noticed the mounting pile of unopened bills on the kitchen counter. It was small, manageable, nothing dire. but it was the first time in years she hadn't seen Elena's neat handwriting scribbled across envelopes. Paid. Due next Friday. Auto-deducted. Roger walked in, rubbing his back. She's still not answering? Linda shook her head. Maybe we should, I don't know, try harder. Roger grunted and sat down. She'll come around, she always does. But even he didn't sound sure anymore. That night, as Linda poured herself a cup of tea, her hand trembled just enough to spill a drop on the counter. She watched it slide toward the edge like a tear she couldn't quite catch. The house, once a place of routine and autopilot comfort, suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not broken, not chaotic, just hollow. And then, when she sat down and picked up her phone to try calling again, she hesitated. Her thumb hovered over Elena's name. She wanted to ask why. Why the silence? Why the cold shoulder? Why now? But the question she should have been asking, the one she was still too scared to speak, was, what did we do to deserve it? Elena lay in bed that same night, her phone face down on the nightstand. She couldn't explain the ache in her chest or why her muscles felt like lead. It wasn't just about the will, it was about being erased, long before paper made it official. She thought about sending a message, something short, something simple. But her fingers didn't move. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered the flickering light above her parents' kitchen sink, the one she used to replace every spring without being asked. She wondered how long it would take them to fix it. Then she wondered if they'd even notice it was broken. Elena didn't return any of their calls for 11 days. Not out of cruelty, not even anger. It was something quieter than that, something harder to name. A silence she owed herself, a silence she had never before allowed to exist between them. For years she had carried their routines like oxygen, predictable, weighty, essential. Now her absence moved like a phantom through the house on Cypress Lane, unsettling but not yet understood. At first, her parents didn't panic. Linda stirred soup at the stove and muttered, "She's probably on a deadline." Roger read the paper, looked up once to say, "She always checks in by Sunday," then went back to circling crossword clues he wouldn't solve. Neither of them mentioned the envelope Elena had seen. They didn't know she had read the will, but the air had changed, and part of them sensed it. The first week without her was only mildly inconvenient. The house functioned technically. Bills still came in the mail, prescriptions still needed picking up, and the fridge emptied itself just like always. Only now, no one refilled it. Linda stood in the middle of the kitchen one afternoon, staring at a pantry that once replenished itself like magic, and frowned. Roger's blood pressure pills ran out and stayed out for 3 days. Linda forgot how to log into the insurance portal. The password notebook Elena had given them was nowhere to be found. They didn't argue, they just waited. As if Elena would walk through the door again, grocery bags in hand, keys jingling like the return of order, but she didn't. Elena's days looked different now. She woke up later, let herself skip her usual protein smoothie. She turned off notifications from her family group chat. She started journaling in the early mornings, writing long, looping thoughts about boundaries and betrayal and what it meant to finally stop rescuing people who never thought to rescue you back. It wasn't bitterness she felt. It was a grief so slow it had gone unnoticed until now. On a Saturday, she visited the public library near her apartment and browsed the art section, something she hadn't done since college. There, she found an old book on coastal architecture and sat down on the cold tile floor between the shelves, thumbing through photos of marshland cottages. She was halfway through a chapter on structural foundations when her phone buzzed. Again. Her mother. Elena flipped the phone over without looking. That night, she passed the spot near Forsyth Park where she used to walk with her father as a child. Back then, he'd lift her up and call her his little co-pilot as they watched the squirrels dart between trees. She'd held his hand so tightly, convinced he was the strongest man in the world. How strange that memory felt now. The man in the recliner was not the man in her memory. Or perhaps he never had been. Perhaps the hero had only existed because she needed him to. Meanwhile, at home, the quiet was starting to wear thin. Linda began to pace in the afternoons, folding and refolding dish towels just to have something to do. She checked the mailbox 3 times a day. She baked banana bread again and again, hoping the smell might summon her daughter like a childhood memory. Roger grew irritable. When the light in the hallway burned out and he didn't know where to find replacement bulbs, he slammed the cupboard door hard enough to shake dust from the vent. Linda tried to brush off his frustration. She's just taking space. She's allowed that. Roger didn't answer. On the 12th day, a notice from the electric company arrived. Past due. Nothing drastic, but enough to sting. Linda set it on the counter and stared at it for a long time. Then she opened the drawer beneath the sink and pulled out the old tin where they kept receipts, old bills, and, though she wouldn't admit it, printed email chains from Elena, guides for logging in, tracking payments, managing online accounts. She unfolded one of the pages. Step 1, go to account login. Step 2, enter email. Step 3, use the password I created for you, your wedding date plus 123. Her hand trembled as she reached for the laptop. It took her 15 minutes and 3 failed attempts to get in. When she did, the screen felt too bright. She scrolled quickly, heart racing, and typed in a payment. The page froze. She tried again. The site crashed. Across the room, Roger watched. "Let me try," he said, rising with effort. Between the two of them, it took over an hour. The payment went through, barely. Linda sank into a chair and stared at her hands. "How did it get this hard?" she whispered. Roger didn't answer. When the doorbell rang that evening, they both jolted. But it wasn't Elena. It was Mrs. Raines from next door, with a plate of shortbread cookies and a look of mild concern. "Noticed your trash hasn't been brought in," she said softly. "Everything all right?" Linda smiled thinly. "Just a busy few weeks." Mrs. Raines didn't press, but before she left she said, "Tell Elena I said hello. Haven't seen her in a while." "Miss that girl's smile." After the door closed, Linda stood in the hallway, her fingers grazing the light switch Elena had replaced last winter after Roger nearly shocked himself trying to fix it. She thought of the photo album again, the one tucked under the guest bed. She hadn't opened it in years. That night, she did. Isabel's face smiled up at her in photo after photo, missing teeth, school projects, art awards. A trip to California the day she graduated from NYU, her first art gallery. There were 2 photos of Elena, one as a toddler, held in Linda's arms at a Christmas party, the other, at 10, sitting on the edge of a dock alone. The emptiness in the pages after that was so loud it made Linda's throat close. Elena had never asked for recognition, never demanded praise. She just did. She appeared with groceries. She fixed broken sinks. She translated insurance codes. She kept the wheels turning so quietly that no one noticed they were spinning until they stopped. Linda closed the album and pressed it against her chest. "I didn't mean to forget you," she whispered. But some things aren't about intention. Back in her apartment, Elena couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot to her living room and stood by the window, looking out at the quiet city below. The streetlights blinked steadily, each one a small beacon of order. She felt both guilt and relief. What if they truly didn't notice she was gone? What if they did and said nothing? The ache was not new. It had lived inside her since childhood, but now it had shape, definition, a name. The next morning she went to the community center. Caleb was waiting with his science fair poster, beaming. "I got picked for regionals," he shouted. "They said my volcano was awesome." Elena smiled and gave him a high five. "Of course it was. You built it like a pro." For a moment she forgot the weight of her family. For a moment someone was simply happy because she had shown up. That evening she sat on her couch with a blanket wrapped around her legs, sipping hot tea. Her phone buzzed again. This time she picked it up. One missed call from Isabel, one voicemail from Linda. She hesitated, then she pressed play. Linda's voice was soft, uncertain. "I know you're busy. I know we haven't. I haven't always said it, but I miss you. I miss your help, yes, but more than that, I miss your laugh in this house. I baked the bread. It's still warm." Elena let the message finish. She didn't cry. She didn't call back. But for the first time, she considered what might happen if she did, and what might happen if she didn't. The sound of the rain against the hospital windows was soft but persistent. Like it, too, refused to let her ignore the moment. Elena stood with her hands in her coat pockets, the warmth of her body useless against the cold that had settled in her bones. She kept replaying Isabel's words. "She's not your birth mother. Your real mom was Annalise." Linda was a shadow behind a mask. The woman who had raised her had done so out of duty or shame, but never fully out of love. And now Roger lay sedated behind a sterile wall, a scar forming over his chest, stitched together by surgeons and timing and chance. Elena couldn't summon the feeling she knew she should have. The fear, yes. The confusion. Even something that resembled compassion. But the grief? It was as though it couldn't find a home in her body. How do you grieve someone who didn't know how to hold you? When the nurse finally allowed them in, Linda was already by Roger's side, brushing a damp cloth across his forehead. She looked up as Elena entered but said nothing. There was a tremble in her hands that betrayed what her eyes refused to reveal. She was unraveling. Slowly, carefully, pretending to hold herself together for a man who wouldn't have known how to ask for help if it punched him in the chest. Elena stood at the foot of the bed, unsure if she was intruding or arriving. Roger was pale, smaller than he'd ever looked to her, the lines around his eyes deeper, his breath thin and drawn out in small mechanical puffs. There were tubes, machines, numbers blinking on monitors, an orchestra of fragility. For a second, she saw him the way she had as a child, towering, steady, invincible. Then she blinked, and he was just a man who had been lucky to survive. "Thank you for coming," Linda said quietly, not looking at her directly. Elena nodded, her jaw tight. "Of course." That night, Isabel and Elena shared a blanket on a stiff hospital waiting room couch. Neither of them slept. Sometime near dawn, Isabel turned to her, her voice a whisper so raw it could splinter wood. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." "I don't even know what to say," Elena replied. "Everything I thought I understood, it just flipped." "I know," Isabel said, "and I hate that it took something like this for us to start talking." The word "us" hung there for a moment, heavy, uncertain, but alive. They returned to the house on Cypress Lane 3 days later, when Roger was stable enough to be discharged. He insisted on walking himself to the car, though he could barely manage the curb without swaying. Elena offered her arm. He didn't take it. Old habits die louder than old pride. Linda had cleaned the house obsessively while they waited for Roger's return. The windows gleamed, the rugs had been shampooed, there were fresh flowers on the counter, and, without a word, Elena noticed something she never expected to see. Her photo. Her college graduation picture. Framed. Perched on the living room shelf beside Isabel's Paris Art Gala snapshot. Elena said nothing. Dinner that night was awkward, quiet, and full of careful glances. Linda served pot roast and overcooked carrots, her hands shaking slightly as she passed the plates. Roger barely spoke, but every now and then, he looked at Elena as though searching for something. Maybe approval, maybe forgiveness, maybe just recognition that she was still there. After the dishes were cleared, Elena started to gather the cleaning supplies, a habit she hadn't questioned in years. But then she paused. She turned to Linda and said, "Why don't you stay with Dad?" "He needs you. Isabel and I will take care of this." There was silence for a beat too long. Then Linda nodded, her eyes glossy. She left the kitchen without a word. Isabel opened the cupboard and started stacking dishes, her movements uncertain. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. "No," Elena said honestly, "but I'm here." They worked in quiet coordination, the kind that's only possible when pain has softened into something more honest. They found a rhythm. Wash, dry, stack. They even laughed once when the dish soap overflowed onto the floor and Isabel nearly slipped. When the kitchen was clean, Elena reached for her coat. Where are you going? Isabel asked. Grocery store, Elena said. They haven't shopped in forever. Want company? Elena hesitated, then nodded. They drove through the humid Savannah night with the windows down. The air smelled like gardenias and rain-drenched pavement. At the store, they moved like a team. Chicken, herbs, rice, vegetables. They bickered about which brand of pasta sauce tasted more like their childhood. They picked up fresh fruit and wine, laughed at old ladies arguing over coupons. For a moment, it felt normal, but in the car, as they pulled into the driveway, something shifted. Elena turned off the engine but didn't move. Isabel didn't either, and then, with a trembling voice, she said, "There's more." Elena turned toward her, every nerve bracing. "I didn't tell you everything about Annalise," Isabel whispered. "I found out more when I was in high school, after I overheard Mom and Dad talking. I confronted her, and she told me Annalise was her cousin, but also she was the one they hated for years. They blamed her for everything, said she was selfish, reckless, a mistake." Elena stared ahead, her fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel. "She was 17 when she had you," Isabel continued. "She was using, lost. But she kept you. She tried. She moved back here hoping Mom would help, and for a while she did, until the overdose." The words sat heavy between them. "I found her name in an old registry," Isabel said. "I found where she was buried, in Vermont. I was going to go, but I couldn't. I didn't know if it was my place." Elena turned slowly to look at her. "Do you still have the address?" Isabel nodded. "Then we'll go." Back inside the house, Roger was asleep on the recliner, a blanket tucked around his feet. Linda sat on the couch, clutching a teacup. She looked up as the girls entered, eyes expectant, maybe even hopeful. Elena didn't say a word. She set the groceries on the counter. Her movements were calm, precise. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask why. She didn't demand explanations or apologies. She simply started unpacking bags, rice, flour, olive oil, each item a symbol of what she was willing to offer and what she no longer would. Linda stepped closer. "I want to talk," she said softly. Elena met her eyes, and for the first time in years, her voice didn't shake. "Not tonight." Linda stepped back, and Elena turned away, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. That night, she and Isabel stayed up late in Elena's apartment, sitting on the floor with glasses of wine, poring over what little they knew of Annalise, an obituary, a school photo, a single quote from a yearbook. "She sings when she's scared." Elena couldn't sleep after Isabel left. She stood at her window again, eyes cast upward, tracing stars between the clouds. She didn't know what kind of woman Annalise had been, but she wanted to find out. Not because she needed a mother, but because she deserved the truth. The road to Vermont stretched like a ribbon across the landscape, winding through rolling hills and bursts of golden foliage. Elena drove in silence, her hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning the road ahead, but lost in thought. Beside her, Isabel sat curled in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of a folded map they didn't need. The GPS had been set hours ago, but the map, creased and worn, felt like something tangible to hold on to. Something old school. Something human. They hadn't spoken much since they crossed the state line. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything worth saying lived in a space they had only just begun to reopen between them. There was an unspoken agreement in the air, a pact sealed not by apology, but by intention. They were here together. That was enough for now. Elena had never been to Middlebury before. The town greeted them like a watercolor painting. Quiet streets lined with brick shops, old churches with pointed steeples, and houses with white porches that sagged from age, not neglect. It was the kind of place where time moved at a slower cadence, where the ghosts didn't haunt so much as they lingered politely, asking only to be remembered. The cemetery was tucked behind a small Methodist church on the edge of town. It wasn't grand or sprawling. It was humble. Just a few dozen headstones, some leaning, some freshly cleaned, others disappearing into the ground like names sinking into silence. They found Annalise near a tree whose branches curled like reaching hands. Her stone was modest, weathered by decades of snow and sun. It read, Annalise Ray, 1976 to 2000, she sang when she was scared. The quote hit Elena harder than she'd expected, not because it was poetic, though it was, but because it felt like something that had survived her mother. A piece of her spirit, fossilized in words. She didn't remember Annalise's voice. She didn't remember her arms or her scent or the lullabies she may have sung. But now she knew she had sung it all. And that changed everything. She knelt in the damp grass, her fingers brushing the carved letters. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply breathed, slow and steady, letting her presence speak for her. Isabel hovered nearby, watching. She had brought a small bouquet of wild daisies, and when Elena nodded, she stepped forward and laid them gently at the base of the stone. She was younger than I am now, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Isabel replied. I think about that all the time. Do you think she loved me? Elena asked, surprising herself with the rawness of the question. Isabel didn't hesitate. I do. I think she loved you the best way she could. And I think Mom never forgave her for that. They stayed there for a while, long enough for the light to shift and the wind to pick up, carrying leaves in swirling dances across the grass. Eventually, a voice broke the stillness. Are you here for Annalise? An older man asked, approaching slowly from the path. He wore a soft wool coat and carried a small book tucked under his arm. Elena stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. Yes, we're family? He nodded as if the answer didn't surprise him. I'm Father Hayes. I knew her when she was a teenager. Did her service. Not many came. Elena's heart clenched. I never got to know her. She was troubled, he said gently. But she was kind, artistic, fierce in her own way. She used to sit under that tree over there and draw birds. Said she liked them because they didn't ask for much. Elena followed his gaze to a low-hanging maple tree with a bench beneath it. She tried to picture her mother there, sketching quietly, perhaps with her infant daughter asleep in a nearby stroller. Do you know why she? Elena began, but her voice broke. Father Hayes's expression softened. She struggled with addiction. Started young. Tried to clean up after she had you, but the past doesn't always let go so easy. She was trying, though. She really was. They thanked him and walked back to the car in silence, their shoes crunching against the gravel. That night, they stayed in a tiny inn overlooking a creek. Elena lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the water rush over rocks outside the window. She thought of Annalise drawing birds. She thought of a 17-year-old girl in over her head, fighting demons with a baby on her hip and a shaky hand trying to color in the lines. And she thought of Linda, 20 years old herself, cleaning up the aftermath, taking in a child that wasn't hers by blood, and, intentionally or not, never letting her forget it. The next morning they walked through town. They found the diner where Annalise had waitressed briefly, and an old bartender who remembered her voice. She sang when the place was empty, he said, smiling. Something old. Patsy Cline, maybe. She'd lean on the counter like the whole world was a song. They left town by mid-afternoon. Elena stared out the window as the mountains disappeared behind them, the pieces of her identity both shattered and strangely whole. Back in Savannah, Roger was recovering slowly. The house on Cypress Lane had quieted even more, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but tentative. Elena visited once, briefly. She helped Linda with a few medical forms, reviewed prescriptions, then left before dinner. Linda didn't push. She looked tired, older than Elena had ever noticed. When Elena kissed Roger's forehead on the way out, he muttered, "Glad you came, kiddo." It was the most tenderness he'd shown in months. She didn't go back the following week, not because she was angry, but because she needed space to grow into what she'd just learned. Her sessions at the pottery studio became more frequent. She let the clay center her. She made vases, cups, and misshapen bowls, her hands finding a rhythm that soothed the tightness in her chest. Isabel became a regular in her apartment, often showing up with paint on her hands and a bottle of red wine. They sat on the floor, ate delivery, and talked, really talked, for the first time in their lives. "You're the strongest person I know," Isabel said one evening, twirling noodles around her fork. "I should have told you that years ago." Elena smiled faintly. Better late than never. They both laughed. A real one this time. On a quiet Saturday, Elena pulled out an old sketchbook and began to draw. She didn't know what she was making, only that her hand moved with purpose. When she was done, she stared at the lines, surprised. It was a small cottage by a river with a wraparound porch and a tree out front, branches like open arms. In the corner, she wrote one word: home. Not the place she'd grown up in, not the people who raised her, but the space she was creating now, piece by piece, with her own hands. That night, she lit a candle by her window, just like Annalise might have once done. She whispered a thank you to the air, to the ghosts that had come and gone, and to the parts of herself that were finally learning to sing again, even when scared. Life after truth didn't explode, it unfolded. There was no grand confrontation, no climactic apology that undid the quiet wounds, no revelation that mended decades in a heartbeat. What remained instead was space. Not empty space, but necessary space. Room for Elena to stand still and breathe without being asked to give something away. It was the kind of space she had never been allowed to claim growing up, not in a house where her silence had been expected, her usefulness assumed. In the weeks after the trip to Vermont, she didn't return to Cypress Lane regularly. She dropped off medication once, picked up the mail another time. She paid a few overdue utility bills, not because she had to, but because letting them pile up in someone else's chaos still made her stomach twist. But she didn't stay long. She didn't linger. Linda never questioned the distance. If anything, she seemed to shrink inside it, folding herself into smaller corners of the house, her voice softer, her demands fewer. Roger, recovering but slower than expected, took to watching the driveway like a man expecting a storm. When Elena's car pulled in, he'd straighten in his chair, and when she left, his gaze would trail her taillights, with something between gratitude and guilt. She felt neither pity nor bitterness when she saw them. What she felt was something stranger, liberation without celebration. They were no longer the center of her gravity. She had spun free. The pottery studio became a quiet sanctuary. She lost hours at the wheel, the hum of clay beneath her fingers like a second pulse. Each piece she shaped held a small thread of her healing: a chipped mug, a vase with uneven curves, a bowl that wobbled on the table but held its contents just the same. Imperfect things, but whole in their purpose. Just like her. One afternoon, she opened a new shelf in the studio and labeled it with her initials. E.S. Her instructor, a kind woman named Ruth, smiled and said, "You're building something that lasts." Elena didn't reply, but her heart tucked the words away like a keepsake. Harper's? No, Isabel's. Visits became frequent. They had become sisters in the way they hadn't managed to be as kids, not out of circumstance, but out of choice. They called each other on bad days and sat together in the grocery line like an old married couple, arguing over which frozen pizza tasted less like cardboard. They teased and bickered, but under all of it was a reverence, a tenderness neither of them said out loud. One Friday, Isabel arrived at Elena's apartment carrying 2 paint-splattered tote bags, a half-eaten muffin, and a bottle of Pinot Noir. "You're coming with me tomorrow," she announced, kicking the door shut with her foot. Elena raised an eyebrow. "To where?" "To the community center. They're hosting an art day for kids. I volunteered us." "I don't know anything about teaching kids to paint." "You're not. You're helping me set up. I need someone responsible. Someone who can manage chaos without panicking. So, obviously you." Elena sighed. "You really can't take no for an answer, can you? Not when it comes to you." That Saturday, the center bustled with noise and little feet and sticky hands. Kids ran between tables, flinging paint like confetti. One boy tried to sculpt a dragon out of Play-Doh and glue sticks. Another asked if clouds had bones. Elena didn't know the answer, but she promised to look it up. For a moment, she stood still in the chaos, watching Isabel guide a child's hand across a canvas, her voice soft and encouraging. Something unspooled in Elena's chest, a thread of joy, unexpected but welcome. This was a different kind of family, a version born not from obligation, but from showing up, from choosing to see each other clearly. Later that evening, they sat on the curb outside the center eating tacos from a food truck. The sky was soft lavender, the sun a sleepy orange behind the trees. "Do you ever wish it had all been different?" Isabel asked, licking salsa from her thumb. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared at the horizon, the way it seemed to promise more even as it disappeared. "No," she said finally. "If it had been different, I wouldn't be here, and here, it's good." Isabel smiled. "Yeah, it is." That week, Elena finally framed one of her old sketches. It was a design she'd done in college for an open-concept community library. Sleek wood beams, skylights, cozy corners for kids and elders alike. She hung it in her living room opposite the window where the morning light hit just right. It wasn't perfect. The perspective was off. But it reminded her who she was before the silence taught her to shrink. One night she got a call from Linda. Not a voicemail, not a text, a call. Elena stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Linda replied. Her voice was hesitant, unsure of its welcome. I was wondering if you were free for dinner Sunday. Nothing fancy, just, I'd like to have you here, if you want." Elena leaned against the counter, the phone warm in her hand. She considered saying no. She considered asking why, but instead she said, "I'll think about it." "Okay," Linda said softly. "Thank you." She did go that Sunday. The house hadn't changed, but it felt different. The lights were dimmer, the table was smaller, the energy muted. Roger sat at the end of the table, thinner but alert. Linda had cooked roast chicken the way Elena liked it, with rosemary and lemon. There was banana bread on the counter. There was no speech, no apology, no forced moment, just clinking silverware and the occasional shared glance. But halfway through the meal, Roger cleared his throat and said, "You've always been the one who holds things together. I know we don't say it much. But I've been thinking about that. About you." Elena didn't reply, but she didn't need to. Her eyes were full, and he saw it. As she left that night, Linda walked her to the door. The air between them buzzed with everything unsaid. "Thank you for coming," Linda whispered. Elena turned the knob, then paused. "I'm not coming back to how things were," she said quietly. "I'll help where I can. But not like before. That part of me is somewhere else now." Linda nodded slowly, her eyes shining. "I know, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see you." Elena nodded once, then stepped into the night. The weeks turned into a new rhythm, a rhythm with boundaries. Elena visited when she wanted to, not when she was expected. She shared stories with Isabel. She taught Caleb fractions through pottery metaphors and watched the way his face lit up when he got it. She didn't need closure in the way she once thought. What she found instead was ownership of her time, of her love, of the story she was writing now, one that had less to do with being anyone's daughter and more to do with becoming fully herself. And yet, through it all, she still carried Annalise with her, not as a ghost, but as a pulse. She thought of her when she saw wild daisies. She whispered to her in quiet moments when she shaped clay or stared at stars. She didn't know what her mother might have become if she'd had another chance, but Elena knew one thing with certainty. She had survived. Not the kind of survival that makes headlines, but the kind that builds a life, that chooses softness over bitterness, that learns how to stand alone without being lonely. One evening, as the sun set over Savannah and the air turned cool, Elena stood by her window, candle lit, tea in hand, and whispered into the fading light, "I'm here." It was not a plea. It was a declaration. Elena's story was never about a single betrayal. It was about a lifetime of quiet ones. The kind that don't scream or slam doors, but settle into the corners of your soul like dust. Small dismissals, emotional absences, the weight of being needed without being seen. Her life for years had been held together by unspoken contracts. She would keep the lights on, manage the chaos, carry the weight, and in return, she would receive silence. Maybe the occasional nod, maybe a grunt of approval over dinner, but never the warmth she had unknowingly starved for. And yet, even in that silence, Elena stayed. She showed up. She bent herself into shapes that fit the needs of others, mistaking endurance for love and responsibility for belonging. That is, until she found that envelope. That cruel, matter-of-fact legal document that confirmed what her heart had known for years, but never dared name. She was never really chosen. Not by the people who raised her, not by the life that had shaped her. The discovery of the will, her name absent, her contributions ignored, wasn't just a legal slight. It was a mirror held up to everything she'd given without being asked, and everything she'd never received despite giving it all. That moment split her world open, and in that fracture she found a beginning. Her retreat was quiet, measured, a withdrawal not rooted in vengeance but self-preservation. The woman who once organized every appointment, paid every bill, filled every fridge, simply stopped. And when she did, the silence echoed through the house she had held together like a second heartbeat. But life, as it always does, came crashing back in. Her father's heart attack didn't just bring her back physically, it jolted her emotionally. It reminded her that love, for all its scars and flaws, was still buried under the dust. And it was there, in the sterile brightness of a hospital room, that the second truth unraveled. She wasn't their biological daughter. She had been taken in, but not with open arms, more like clenched fists and whispered obligation. She had been raised inside someone else's grudge. Annalise. The name landed softly and shook everything. Her real mother. A girl who had once sung when she was scared. A girl who had tried, failed, and died before Elena could remember the sound of her voice. And yet, in Vermont, among the trees and the modest gravestones, Elena found her. Not in form, but in spirit. In the warmth of a bartender's memory. In the soft brushstrokes of a story half told. In the way her own heart beat stronger knowing where she'd come from, no matter how broken the path had been. And from that moment forward, Elena didn't return to her old life. She built a new one. She found refuge in clay, in art, in the soft friendship of children who saw her not for what she could fix, but for who she simply was. She redefined sisterhood with Isabel, not as a forced familial tie, but as a bond born from shared reckoning and real choice. She reclaimed time, she reclaimed silence, she reclaimed self. Her visits to Cypress Lane became offerings, not obligations. She helped where she could, but she no longer bled herself dry. And when Linda and Roger looked at her now, they saw someone they could no longer take for granted. Not because she demanded it, but because she stopped performing to be accepted. That was the transformation. Elena learned that love without acknowledgement is erosion. That family isn't forged in shared blood or years of routine. It's built in reciprocity and truth, in the space where respect and vulnerability meet. She didn't sever ties, but she no longer let them bind her. The house she grew up in didn't change, but Elena did. And that made all the difference. What can we take from Elena's journey? It's this. Sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is step back from the people you love, not to hurt them, but to remember who you are without them. Love is not measured by sacrifice alone. If you are always the one fixing, holding, caring, and no one meets you with gratitude or grace, you are not in a relationship. You are in servitude. And that is not love. That is a slow death of the self. Elena's story teaches us that setting boundaries isn't rejection. It's self-rescue. It's saying, I matter too. And when we find the courage to say that, to ourselves, to others, to the world, we don't lose love. We invite the real kind in. So ask yourself, who would you be if you stopped performing? If you stopped trying to earn the love that should have been given freely? Where would your energy go if it wasn't spent on managing someone else's expectations? These are hard questions, but necessary ones. And they don't always require dramatic endings. Sometimes, like Elena, the story isn't about walking away forever. It's about walking back on your own terms. It's about returning to the table not as the servant, but as a guest. It's about knowing you belong, not because someone told you, but because you finally told yourself. Now, let's turn this reflection into something even more real. If you were Elena, standing at that crossroads, learning the truth, facing the weight of years, what would you have done first? Would you A, walk away for good, finally choosing your own peace over family bonds? B, stay in quiet resentment, doing what you always did, just with a little more distance? Comment your answer below with A or B and tell us why. Let's see how others would have responded in her shoes. As you sit with your own thoughts, I'd love to hear your reflections. What resonated most with you in Elena's journey? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Maybe even yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments so others can be inspired by your experience. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, heard, or reminded you of your own quiet strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Stories that aren't just told, they're felt. Stories that help us remember we're not alone, not in our hurt, not in our healing. Because just like Elena, maybe it's not about being chosen by others. Maybe it's about finally choosing ourselves.